Back in early April of this year, in a post that read more like a threat delivered over a backyard fence than a formal statement of official military policy, the President of the United States warned that a specific upcoming Tuesday would become, in his own words, Power Plant Day, and that Iran would start living through something close to hell if the Strait of Hormuz stayed closed to international shipping traffic. At the time, plenty of people treated that kind of language as bluster, the sort of dramatic warning that gets thrown around during a tense standoff but rarely translates into an actual sustained military campaign against a country's civilian energy grid. Those people, as it turned out, were wrong. Over the following months, that threat turned into one of the most consequential and most controversial phases of the entire war, a sustained campaign that hit bridges, power plants, desalination facilities, and even a nuclear power site still under construction, triggering a retaliatory cycle that's now left tens of thousands of people on both sides of the Persian Gulf without reliable water or electricity. So let's walk through exactly what happened, why energy and transportation infrastructure became such a central battlefield in this war, and what the human and strategic cost of that decision has actually turned out to be. To understand how we got to an actual executed power plant day, you have to go back to the collapse of the ceasefire that had briefly held earlier this year. An interim agreement, formalized through a memorandum of understanding, had quieted the fighting for a stretch, but a renewed battle over control of the Strait of Hormuz shattered that truce entirely. Iran struck a merchant vessel that was ultimately abandoned in flames by its own crew, and in the days that followed, Tehran formally closed the strait and began launching missiles and drones at its Gulf neighbors. The United States responded by reimposing its naval blockade and stepping up strikes, and it was in the middle of that escalating standoff that the president first floated the specific threat to target Iran's power plants and bridges directly if the strait remained closed. That threat wasn't idle rhetoric attached to a random date on the calendar. It was framed explicitly as consequence and cause, keep the strait shut, and civilian infrastructure becomes the target. The initial version of that threat in early April didn't immediately produce the massive campaign everyone braced for. In fact, just before the specific date the president had named, he actually extended a pause on strikes against Iran's energy sites by 10 days, citing progress in negotiations and noting that Iran had allowed several oil tankers to transit the strait during that window. That pause showed a real willingness, at least temporarily, to let diplomacy work rather than immediately following through on the power plant threat. But even during that pause, Israel intensified its own strikes on Iran's industrial and nuclear-adjacent infrastructure, hitting some of the country's largest steel plants and striking the Khandaq heavy water complex near Iraq, a facility that Israeli officials alleged was being rebuilt with the potential to eventually produce weapons-grade plutonium. On separate strike hit a yellowcake production facility in Yazd province, a site tied to the earliest stage of uranium processing. Iran's Atomic Energy Organization confirmed both strikes and stated there had been no radioactive leaks. But the timing made clear that even a diplomatic pause on one front didn't mean a full pause on pressure across the broader nuclear and industrial landscape. It's worth spending more time on that 10-day pause back in early April, because the way it unfolded actually tells you a lot about how genuinely fluid and reactive this entire war has been from one week to the next. The president's decision to extend that pause specifically cited progress in negotiations, and Iran's willingness to allow oil tankers through the strait, which suggests that even the most aggressive-sounding threats in this conflict have consistently remained conditional on Iranian behavior rather than being locked in as an unstoppable, predetermined course of action. That pattern matters enormously for understanding the overall shape of this war, because it means nearly every major escalation, including the eventual execution of the power plant campaign months later, followed a fairly consistent sequence. A specific threat gets issued, a window for compliance or negotiation gets offered, and only once that window closes without the desired outcome does the actual military action follow through. That's a meaningfully different pattern than a war driven by pure, unconditional escalation, and it suggests that at least some of what looks like unpredictable, dramatic policy from the outside is actually operating according to a fairly consistent internal logic of graduated pressure and conditional restraint. That said, the parallel activity happening even during that pause deserves attention too, because it shows that de-escalation on one specific front, in this case the direct threat against power plants and bridges, didn't mean de-escalation across the entire conflict simultaneously. Israel's intensified strikes on Iran's steel plants and its nuclear-adjacent industrial sites during that exact same window demonstrate how this war has never really operated as a single, unified escalation ladder controlled by one central decision-maker. It's been running across multiple, only loosely coordinated fronts at once. American pressure over the Strait of Hormuz, Israeli strikes on nuclear and industrial infrastructure, and Iran's own retaliatory campaign against Gulf allies, each moving according to its own internal timeline and its own set of triggers. Untangling which specific strike triggered which specific retaliation becomes genuinely difficult once you're tracking multiple semi-independent escalation tracks running in parallel. And that complexity is a big part of why this war has proven so resistant to the kind of clean, single off-ramp that a simpler two-country conflict might have found months ago. That relative restraint didn't last. By early July, with the ceasefire fully collapsed and Iran continuing its attacks on shipping through the strait, the earlier power plant threat stopped being a hypothetical and became an active military campaign. Central Command confirmed it had launched a 7th consecutive night of strikes against Iran, describing the effort as hitting surveillance sites, military logistics infrastructure, underground weapon storage, and maritime capabilities, using fighter aircraft, aerial drones, and warships. But, alongside that military-focused language, the campaign had unmistakably widened to include the exact category of targets the president had named months earlier: energy infrastructure and the bridges connecting Iran's southern coast to the rest of the country. The most immediately controversial strike in this expanded campaign hit the Darkhoven nuclear power plant, an under-construction facility in Iran's southwestern Khuzestan province. Iran's nuclear energy agency confirmed the strike and condemned it as a clear breach of international law, and the country's deputy foreign minister described the attack as a dangerous assault on civilian infrastructure, vowing a response to defend national security. The International Atomic Energy Agency said it was actively looking into reports of the strike, and crucially noted that the facility was still in the earliest stages of construction and had contained no nuclear material at all when inspectors had last visited the site. That detail matters enormously because it means this specific strike didn't carry the kind of radiological risk that a strike on an active, fueled nuclear facility would, but it still represented a significant escalation in target selection, moving from established military and naval infrastructure into a facility explicitly tied to Iran's civilian nuclear power generation program, regardless of how early in construction it actually was. Alongside the Darkhoven strike, the campaign hit Iran's water infrastructure directly, and this is where the human cost of this phase of the war becomes impossible to ignore. American strikes destroyed a seawater pumping station and a power transformer at a desalination plant in the village of Bunji, near Jask on Iran's southern coast. According to the chief executive of the regional water and wastewater company, that single strike left roughly 10,000 people across 20 separate villages without a functioning water supply. In a region already dealing with punishing summer heat well above 100 degrees, cutting off desalinated water access isn't a minor inconvenience. It's a genuine public health and safety crisis for the civilian population living in those communities, regardless of whatever military value American planners believed the underlying facility held. Iran's own government put a hard number on the broader human toll of this specific stretch of the war, one that put the actual lived consequences of this infrastructure campaign into much sharper focus than any strategic analysis alone ever could. According to the country's health ministry, at least 50 people had been killed and more than 500 injured in American strikes since the beginning of July alone, a toll reported directly by Iranian officials, tracking casualties as this specific phase of the campaign unfolded. Iran's deputy foreign minister went further, declaring that the United States had violated and effectively suspended the entire memorandum of understanding that had briefly stabilized the conflict earlier in the year. Whether or not you take Iran's specific casualty figures at face value, and there's genuine reason for outside skepticism, given how consistently both sides in this war have shaded their public numbers to support their own narrative, the scale of destruction being described, 50 dead and hundreds wounded within a matter of weeks, tells you this phase of the campaign represented a serious and sustained escalation, rather than an isolated symbolic strike. It's worth dwelling on the timing of these specific water and power strikes a little longer, because the environmental backdrop makes an enormous difference in how severe the actual humanitarian consequences turn out to be. This entire stretch of strikes happened during the peak of the Middle Eastern summer, with regional temperatures regularly climbing past 100 degrees Fahrenheit across the Gulf. In that kind of heat, access to clean water and functioning electricity isn't a convenience. It's a genuine matter of survival, particularly for elderly residents, young children, and anyone with existing health conditions that make heat exposure dangerous. A desalination plant going offline during a mild spring week creates real hardship. But the exact same plant going offline in the middle of a summer heat wave creates something closer to an acute public health emergency, especially across 20 separate villages that suddenly found themselves without a functioning water supply at the worst possible moment of the year for that kind of disruption. That environmental context is exactly why aid organizations and international observers tend to treat strikes on water and power infrastructure with such heightened concern compared to other categories of military targets, because the actual severity of the consequences isn't fixed. It scales dramatically based on factors like regional climate and seasonal timing that have nothing to do with the underlying military justification for the strike itself. The bridges targeted during this same window followed the same strategic logic that had defined the earlier bridge campaign around Bandar Abbas, severing the physical connections linking Iran's most important southern port city to the rest of the country. A bridge along the road connecting Rudan and Bandar Abbas was hit directly, and additional strikes damaged infrastructure in Bandar Kamir, part of the same broader effort to disrupt the transportation corridors that Iranian military logistics depend on to move personnel, equipment, and supplies between the coast and the interior. Combined with the strikes on the desalination plant and the Darkhoven nuclear facility, this represented a genuinely comprehensive assault on the systems that keep both Iran's military and its civilian population functioning along that entire stretch of coastline. Iran's retaliation followed almost immediately, and it targeted the exact same category of infrastructure right back, just on the other side of the Gulf. Kuwait reported that Iranian attacks caused what officials described as severe damage to a power and desalination plant, advising civilians to begin rationing electricity as a direct result. That wasn't an isolated incident either, because Kuwait was struck again the following day, with the country's electricity, water, and renewable energy ministry confirming that another power and water distillation plant had been targeted, resulting in a fire in one of the facility's components and forcing several power generation units offline entirely. Kuwait's government formally accused Iran of deliberately targeting civilian and vital facilities within its territory, striking a power and desalination plant for the second time in as many days. Kuwait also announced a temporary closure of its own airspace and reported that operations at Kuwait International Airport had been suspended due to repeated missile and drone threats during this same window. This wasn't a contained two-country exchange anymore, it was a regional infrastructure war, spreading well beyond the original combatants, with a small Gulf nation absorbing real, repeated damage to its own power and water systems purely as a consequence of hosting relationships and geographic proximity to a conflict it didn't start. It's worth understanding exactly why Kuwait's retaliatory strikes carried such disproportionate weight compared to how a similar strike might land in a country with more diverse water infrastructure. Because Kuwait's situation is genuinely unique in this regard. As a desert nation, with essentially no significant natural freshwater sources of its own, Kuwait depends almost entirely on desalination technology to supply its population with drinkable water, meaning a small handful of large-scale desalination and power facilities carry an enormous, concentrated share of the country's total water security. That's precisely why officials describe the damage from these specific strikes as severe rather than routine, and why the government moved quickly to advise civilians to begin rationing electricity, because unlike a country with multiple redundant water sources, rivers, lakes, extensive groundwater reserves, Kuwait genuinely doesn't have many alternative options to fall back on if its concentrated desalination infrastructure gets seriously damaged. Striking that kind of infrastructure in a desert nation carries a fundamentally different and more severe risk profile than striking similar infrastructure almost anywhere else in the world. And that structural vulnerability is exactly why Kuwait's government responded with such urgency and such pointed public criticism after being hit not once but twice within consecutive days. That vulnerability also helps explain why the closure of Kuwait International Airport and the broader disruption to daily life in the country generated so much regional alarm beyond just the immediate infrastructure damage itself. Kuwait has spent this entire war positioned as a country caught in the crossfire rather than an active combatant, hosting American forces and dealing with the consequences of a conflict being fought primarily between other parties. Watching that kind of collateral damage escalate from occasional stray missiles to repeated, deliberate strikes on the country's core water and power infrastructure represents a genuine shift in how directly this war has started touching nations that never chose to be part of it in the first place. And it's exactly the kind of regional spillover that Gulf Cooperation Council officials have been warning about since long before this specific infrastructure campaign began. It's worth being direct about how both sides have framed the legality and morality of these strikes, because the accusations have been flying in both directions, and neither side has been shy about using the harshest possible language available. Iran's foreign ministry described the pattern of American strikes on what it called vital facilities as revealing a systematic and aggressive approach specifically aimed at civilian targets. At the same time, American officials and allied governments have pointed to Iran's own retaliatory strikes on civilian infrastructure in Kuwait, a country not directly party to the underlying dispute over the Strait of Hormuz, as itself representing a clear violation of international humanitarian law, given that targeting civilian infrastructure in a third country with no direct role in the conflict is difficult to justify under almost any legal framework governing armed conflict. Both accusations can be true simultaneously and honestly, based on the pattern of strikes we've just walked through. They probably are. This has become a conflict where both major participants have shown a clear and repeated willingness to target infrastructure that serves overwhelmingly civilian populations, each one justifying its own strikes as a necessary response to the other side's prior escalation. There's a deeper strategic question worth sitting with when it comes to that Darkhaven strike specifically, because it forces a genuinely difficult conversation about where exactly the line sits between a legitimate wartime target and a facility that should remain off limits regardless of its stated purpose. Nuclear power plants, even ones still years away from actually generating electricity, occupy a fundamentally different category from almost every other type of infrastructure in this conflict, because the international community has spent decades building specific legal and normative frameworks around protecting nuclear sites precisely to prevent exactly the kind of catastrophic, potentially uncontrollable consequences that could follow from a strike on an active, fueled reactor. Striking a facility before it reaches that stage arguably sidesteps the most severe version of that risk, but it still represents a meaningful erosion of the broader norm against targeting nuclear infrastructure at all, and once that norm gets crossed, even in a relatively low-risk case like an under-construction plant with no nuclear material present, it becomes considerably easier to justify striking facilities that do carry genuine radiological danger the next time a similar strategic calculation gets made. That's exactly the kind of precedent that arms control experts and international legal scholars tend to worry about most, not necessarily the immediate consequences of any single strike, but the way each individual decision gradually reshapes what future decision makers consider an acceptable target going forward. Let's dig deeper into why energy and water infrastructure specifically became such a central battlefield in this particular phase of the war, because the strategic logic here is genuinely different from the earlier bridge-focused campaign we've discussed before. Bridges primarily serve a transportation and logistics function, disrupting an opponent's ability to physically move military assets around the country. Power plants and desalination facilities serve a different, arguably even more fundamental function. They keep an entire population's basic infrastructure running day to day, independent of whether that population has any direct connection to the military decisions being made by their government. Striking a power grid doesn't just complicate troop movements, it affects hospitals, water treatment, refrigeration for food supplies, and the ability of ordinary households to survive extreme heat, especially in a region where summer temperatures regularly climb well past 100 degrees. That's precisely why targeting this specific category of infrastructure generates so much more international criticism and legal scrutiny than targeting a missile bunker or naval staging pier ever does, because the connection to civilian survival is immediate, direct, and impossible to separate from whatever secondary military value the facility might also provide. And yet, from a pure pressure campaign standpoint, that's also exactly why this category of target became so central to American strategy. Once the earlier, more narrowly military-focused strikes hadn't fully forced Iran back to the negotiating table. There's a specific and fairly blunt strategic logic behind targeting a population's basic services rather than just its military hardware. The theory being that sustained disruption to daily civilian life creates political pressure on a government from its own population, pressure that a purely military campaign focused on remote missile sites and naval vessels never really generates, because most ordinary citizens never see or feel the effects of those more narrowly targeted strikes in their day-to-day lives. Whether or not that kind of pressure campaign actually works as intended, and whether it's even legally or morally justifiable as a strategy in the first place, is a genuinely contested question. But it's clearly the underlying logic that shaped the president's original power plant day threat and the campaign that eventually followed through on it months later. It's worth placing this entire strategy inside a broader historical context too, because the debate over whether targeting an adversary's power grid and water systems represents legitimate warfare or an unacceptable attack on civilians is far from new to this specific conflict. Military campaigns throughout the 20th and 21st centuries have repeatedly grappled with this exact same tension. Targeting an enemy's electrical grid or water treatment systems has shown up as a deliberate strategy in multiple major conflicts, precisely because degrading those systems can meaningfully shorten a war by pressuring a government through its own population's hardship, while simultaneously drawing intense and often lasting international criticism for the civilian suffering that inevitably results. What's different about this specific application of that old strategy is the speed and precision with which it's being executed, combined with the fact that it's unfolding in near real time on social media and international news coverage, meaning the humanitarian consequences of each individual strike become visible and documented almost immediately, rather than emerging gradually through after-action reports written months or years later. That transparency cuts both ways strategically. It means the pressure campaign's effects on Iranian civilian morale become visible to the world just as quickly as they become visible to Iran's own government. But it also means every documented instance of civilian hardship, the villages without water, the Kuwaiti families rationing electricity, becomes immediate ammunition for international criticism and diplomatic pressure aimed at ending the campaign altogether. There's also a broader economic dimension running underneath all of this that's worth spending real time on, because every one of these strikes, on both sides, has been unfolding against the backdrop of an already severely disrupted global energy market. The Strait of Hormuz remains the exit route for roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil and gas supply, and the ongoing standoff over control of that waterway has already been pushing prices upward for months. Every additional strike on energy infrastructure inside Iran, and every retaliatory strike on energy infrastructure in Kuwait, adds another layer of uncertainty to a global market that's already been reacting nervously to every twist in this conflict. Reporting throughout this period consistently noted rising gas prices, tracking almost in real time with each new round of escalation, a direct, measurable link between strikes happening thousands of miles away and the price ordinary consumers pay at a fuel pump on the other side of the world. That's part of why this specific infrastructure targeting phase of the war carries weight well beyond the immediate region. Because unlike a purely military exchange between two countries' armed forces, attacks on the actual energy production and transportation infrastructure surrounding the Strait of Hormuz ripple out into global commodity markets almost instantly. Let's also talk about the specific controversy around striking a nuclear facility, even when still under construction and without any nuclear material present, because that detail deserves more attention than it initially got amid everything else happening during this same stretch of strikes. Nuclear facilities occupy a genuinely unique and heavily protected category under international law and international norms, precisely because of the catastrophic potential consequences if a strike were ever to release radioactive material into the surrounding environment. The fact that Darkhaven was still under construction and contained no nuclear material at the time of the strike is a genuinely important mitigating detail, and it's likely exactly why the International Atomic Energy Agency's initial response was measured rather than alarmed, focused on investigating and confirming the facts rather than issuing an immediate warning about radiological danger. But the strategic message sent by striking a nuclear power facility at all, regardless of its construction status, shouldn't be understated, because it demonstrates a clear willingness to expand target sets into categories that carry serious symbolic and legal weight, and it sets a precedent that becomes relevant for any future decision about striking Iran's other nuclear-adjacent sites, including facilities that do contain material and do carry genuine radiological risk if struck directly. Iran's deputy foreign minister's response to that specific strike, framing it as a dangerous assault requiring a national security response, reflects just how seriously Tehran treats any strike touching its nuclear infrastructure, even facilities still years away from actual operational status. That kind of heightened, almost automatic escalatory response to any nuclear-adjacent target is worth keeping in mind as this war continues, because it suggests any future strike on Iran's more advanced nuclear sites, the ones that do contain enriched material and do carry genuine safety risk, would likely trigger an even more severe and immediate retaliatory response than what followed the relatively contained Darkhaven strike. Now let's return to the human toll of this entire phase of the war, because it's easy to get lost in the strategic and legal analysis and lose sight of what 50 deaths and 500 injuries in a matter of weeks actually represents on the ground. Every one of those casualties happened in the context of strikes that officials on the American side have consistently described using clinical military terminology, logistics infrastructure, energy sites, dual-use facilities, language that inherently obscures the reality that many of the people affected by these strikes were civilians going about ordinary daily life, drawing water from a desalination plant, crossing a bridge on their commute, living in a village that lost its electricity because a nearby transformer got destroyed. That's not a criticism of either side's specific military decision-making in isolation. War fundamentally involves targeting infrastructure that has both military and civilian value, and that's been true of virtually every major conflict throughout modern history. But it is a reminder that the phrase power plant day, however casually or dramatically it got tossed around in a social media post back in April, ultimately translated into real consequences for tens of thousands of ordinary people on both sides of the Persian Gulf who had no direct role in the military and political decisions driving this war forward. So where does all of this actually leave the broader trajectory of the conflict right now? The infrastructure targeting campaign that grew directly out of that original power plant day threat represents one of the clearest examples yet of how this war has evolved from an initial, more narrowly focused military campaign into something that increasingly touches the basic services and daily survival of ordinary civilians on both sides of the Gulf. Iran's deputy foreign minister's declaration that the Memorandum of Understanding is effectively suspended suggests there's currently very little functioning diplomatic framework left to actually de-escalate this specific cycle of infrastructure strikes and counterstrikes. And Kuwait's repeated targeting shows just how easily this kind of escalation spreads well beyond the two primary combatants once power and water infrastructure become fair game rather than off limits. Every strike on a bridge, a power plant, or a desalination facility adds another data point to an already long and growing list of infrastructure damage on both sides, and every one of those strikes makes the eventual process of rebuilding, negotiating, and restoring some kind of stable peace that much more complicated and that much more expensive, regardless of which side ultimately claims the stronger negotiating position when this war eventually does wind down. What's clear is that this specific threat, once dismissed by some observers as dramatic rhetoric attached to a random date on a calendar, turned out to represent a genuine, deliberate shift in American strategy, one that's been executed with real consistency across bridges in Bandar Abbas, a nuclear facility in Khuzestan, and a desalination plant in Jask, triggering a retaliatory cycle that's now left Kuwaiti civilians rationing electricity and Iranian villagers without reliable water access in the middle of a brutal Middle Eastern summer. Whether that kind of pressure campaign eventually forces a genuine return to the negotiating table, or simply hardens both sides further into an increasingly destructive cycle of infrastructure, strikes, and counterstrikes, is the question that's going to define the next phase of this war. And based on everything that's happened since that original power plant day threat first got posted back in April, there's no strong reason yet to assume this particular escalation ladder has reached its top. If this breakdown helped you understand how a single social media threat back in April eventually turned into one of the most consequential and most civilian-affecting phases of this entire war, go ahead and drop a like, because tracking exactly how rhetoric turns into real, executed military policy across months of gradual escalation takes real time, careful sourcing, and a willingness to sit with genuinely uncomfortable details to piece together accurately. Let me know in the comments whether you think targeting energy and water infrastructure actually represents a legitimate wartime pressure tactic capable of forcing a genuine change in behavior, or whether you think it crosses a line that should remain off limits regardless of which side is doing the striking or how strong their stated military justification happens to be. Subscribe if you want to keep following this conflict closely and in real depth, because between the collapsed Memorandum of Understanding, the ongoing retaliatory strikes now hitting Kuwait repeatedly within a matter of days, and the very real possibility of this infrastructure campaign expanding to additional energy sites on both sides of the Gulf, there's a lot more still unfolding here than any single headline, however dramatic, could ever fully capture on its own. And share this with anyone who's been trying to understand why bridges and power plants specifically became such a central and defining part of this war, because the difference between a purely military campaign and one that increasingly touches ordinary civilian survival, water access, electricity, basic daily function, is exactly the kind of distinction that deserves far more careful attention than it typically gets in a headline built to grab attention rather than explain nuance. Thanks for watching, and we'll be right here the moment this campaign shifts again, whether that means further strikes on additional infrastructure, a renewed push toward genuine negotiations, or another dramatic escalation that reshapes the trajectory of this already long and costly war.